August 10th, 2018 felt like just another warm summer evening at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. The sun was slowly sinking behind Puget Sound, stretching golden light across the runways. Inside the terminal, travelers waited near boarding gates, scrolling on their phones or sipping coffee. Outside, baggage carts rolled past aircraft and ground vehicles moved in steady patterns. Everything looked completely normal. Among the ramp employees working that shift was a 28-year-old man named Richard Russell. Most people knew him by his childhood nickname, Bebo. Richard had grown up in Alaska before eventually moving south. By 2018, he had been employed by Horizon Air for just over 3 years. He was married, taking online college courses, and regularly attended church. Friends described him as kind, humorous, and soft-spoken. At work, Richard held the position of ground service agent with the tow team. That meant he handled luggage, guided aircraft into parking positions, operated pushback tugs, and assisted with basic ground movements. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't high-paying, but Richard never seemed bothered by that. He joked with co-workers, he posted playful videos online about airport life. To everyone around him, he was simply another friendly ramp worker in a reflective vest. And that is what makes his story so unsettling. Because through his job, Richard had unrestricted access to the airside, the secured section of the airport where aircraft are parked, serviced, and maintained. Like thousands of airline employees across the country, he had been issued an airport badge after completing a background check. From that point on, he could move freely around parked airplanes. Ramp employees go through basic daily screening, similar to passengers. But after that, they are largely trusted. Security checks for airside staff mainly focus on preventing theft or smuggling. They do not include psychological evaluations or mental health assessments. Those are typically reserved for pilots, cabin crew, and air traffic controllers. Nothing in Richard's behavior suggested danger. He had no criminal history, no disciplinary record, no visible warning signs. He appeared completely ordinary. That evening, one particular aircraft sat alone on a remote parking stand far from the busy terminal. It was a Bombardier Q400 turboprop, a regional airliner commonly used for short routes along the West Coast. Earlier that day, it had completed a scheduled flight and was now parked overnight. No guard stood nearby. No lock secured the cockpit, because there was no reason to believe anyone authorized to be on the ramp would misuse it. Richard approached the aircraft wearing his safety vest. On surveillance cameras, everything looked routine. He removed the wheel chocks, connected the tug to the nose gear, then opened the cabin door and climbed inside. In the cockpit, he powered up the auxiliary power unit, a small onboard turbine used to supply electricity and air pressure when the main engines are off. Ramp workers are sometimes trained to operate the system. Nothing about this action would have raised suspicion, but Richard didn't stop there. Using knowledge gathered from flight simulator games, online cockpit videos, and public manuals, he slowly configured the aircraft systems, step by step, switch by switch. Eventually, both engines began to spin. Outside, the turboprop blades came alive. Richard exited briefly, repositioned the aircraft toward the taxiway, then disconnected the tug. Without anyone in the cockpit to hold the brakes, the plane started creeping forward. He sprinted back inside, closed the door, and slid into the captain's seat. At this moment, he still could have stopped. He could have shut everything down, walked away. But he didn't. At approximately 7:32 p.m. local time, the Q400 began rolling across the apron under its own power. From a distance, it looked like a normal repositioning move. Air traffic control attempted to contact the aircraft. There was no response. The plane continued onto runway 16 center. Controllers called out again, their voices rising. Still nothing. Then suddenly the aircraft accelerated and lifted off. A passenger airplane had just departed Seattle without clearance. Inside the tower, confusion erupted. No flight plan had been filed. No pushback clearance had been requested. No radio communication existed. Departures were immediately halted. Other aircraft were instructed to hold. Controllers focused all attention on the rogue turboprop now climbing into the evening sky. For several minutes, there was only silence from the cockpit. Then Richard finally answered. He calmly told controllers that he was a ground service agent. He admitted he didn't know how to land, and quietly added, "I wasn't really planning on landing." That was the moment everyone realized this was not a misunderstanding. Fighter jets were placed on alert. The aircraft turned toward Mount Rainier, circling the massive volcano before briefly disappearing from radar. When it reappeared, it headed back toward Puget Sound. Richard's altitude changed constantly. His speed fluctuated. Controllers tried to guide him away from populated areas. He apologized repeatedly, said he didn't want to mess up anyone's day. At times, he sounded excited. At times, scared. And as Seattle watched from below, an ordinary airport worker flew alone through controlled airspace, changing aviation history forever. After circling Mount Rainier, RichardRussell guided the aircraft back toward Puget Sound. His altitude drifted between 6,000 and 15,000 feet as air traffic controllers tried desperately to maintain communication. By now, emergency protocols were fully active. Flights across the region were halted. Aircraft already airborne were placed in holding patterns, and military radar systems had locked onto the stolen Q-400. Several minutes later, controllers finally established more consistent radio contact with Richard. His voice sounded strained. He apologized again, said he had removed his headset briefly because he felt sick, then added quietly that he hoped he wasn't ruining anyone's evening. Controllers reassured him and encouraged him to keep flying steadily while they looked for safe landing options. When asked if he felt comfortable controlling the aircraft, Richard replied confidently that he had played flight video games before and felt okay. He spoke about how beautiful the mountains looked from above. He said everything felt peachy, but soon cracks began to appear. Richard mentioned feeling lightheaded. He asked how to pressurize the cabin, admitting he could see the controls but didn't fully understand them. A professional pilot was patched into the frequency to help guide him through basic procedures. Richard listened, but it was clear he was overwhelmed. Despite that, he continued maneuvering the aircraft, performing wide circles over the water in nearby military airspace. By now, 2 F-15 fighter jets had been scrambled and intercepted the Q-400. They stayed behind him, close enough to act if he turned toward populated areas. Richard seemed aware of their presence. He asked controllers if they were sending jets after him. They reassured him they were only trying to keep other traffic clear. Again, he apologized. He said he didn't want to cause problems for anyone else. At one point, he noticed a ferry crossing Puget Sound below and flew low over it before climbing away. Passengers on board watched in shock as the turboprop passed overhead. Some feared he might crash into the vessel. He did not. He simply climbed and continued circling. His emotions now shifted rapidly. One moment he sounded playful, the next deeply regretful. He spoke about having people who cared about him, then quietly admitted, "I'm just a broken guy. Got a few screws loose, I guess." Controllers gently tried steering him toward nearby runways. McCord Air Force Base, Boeing Field, Tacoma Narrows. Richard declined each suggestion. He worried he would mess things up. He wondered aloud if landing would mean prison for life. He began commenting on his fuel decreasing rapidly. Still, he refused to commit to landing. Then suddenly his tone changed again. He asked whether the plane could do aerobatics. Moments later, he climbed sharply and rolled the Q-400 into a full barrel roll, a maneuver almost unheard of for commercial aircraft. Witnesses captured it on their phones. Astonishingly, the plane recovered only feet above the water. Behind him, the F-15S followed closely, stunned but ready. Richard laughed, clearly surprised that he had pulled it off. But the bravado didn't last. Controllers continued urging him to bring the aircraft down safely. He avoided the topic. Instead, he spoke about the beauty of the Olympic Mountains, about hiking, about nature. Then his voice softened. He said he was sorry. He said he knew this would disappoint people who loved him. He mentioned that one engine felt weak. Shortly afterward, communication became sporadic. Radar showed the aircraft turning south, then west. At approximately 8:46 p.m., after more than 70 minutes in the air, the Q-400 descended rapidly toward Kettering Island. There were no final radio calls. The aircraft struck wooded terrain at high speed. It was completely destroyed on impact. Richard Russell was killed instantly. No passengers were on board. No one on the ground was injured. Later investigation confirmed the descent was intentional. Flight data showed that Richard maintained forward pressure on the controls during the final moments, choosing not to recover. Authorities found no manifesto, no coordinated plan, no warning signs. He had acted entirely alone. He hadn't forced entry. He hadn't bypassed security. He had simply used the access he already possessed. The incident shocked the aviation world. Security procedures were reviewed. The incident shocked the aviation world. Security procedures were reviewed. Policies were tightened. But one uncomfortable truth remained. Modern aviation depends on trust, and Richard Russell slipped through that trust, not as an outsider, but as someone already inside. This wasn't a story about terrorism. It wasn't about sabotage. It was about silent pain, about a man who smiled at coworkers while carrying something heavy inside, and about how sometimes the people who need help most don't show it.